My name is Dr. Gabriel Antario, and there is something happening that the world needs to know about. It all began in January of 2020, when an anomalous tree appeared on the property of a man named Reginald Walker in West Virginia. At the time, I was finishing my doctorate at UCSB and working at a research institute in Florida under Dr. Ben Gosder. After completing my work there, I earned my doctorate and moved to Medina, Ohio, where I began working at a biology lab that I am still with today. From this position, I have been closely monitoring this strange phenomenon ever since. My involvement started in June of 2020, when Dr. Gosder received a call from the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources regarding a possible undiscovered species of tree. We were dispatched to evaluate and catalog it, eager to determine whether we were dealing with something entirely new. Upon arriving at Mr. Walker's property and receiving his permission, we made our way to his backyard, where we were immediately struck by the sheer oddity of the tree before us. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its bark was gray and unnaturally smooth, and its trunk was unusually wide, measuring just shy of 30 feet in circumference. The roots twisted out of the ground in places, gnarled and exposed like skeletal fingers reaching for the surface. The branches were long and sinuous, extending outward in a manner that defied common tree growth patterns. Strangely, around 80% of its branches were nearly parallel to the ground, deviating no more than 17 degrees in either direction. Its sparse foliage consisted of thin, wispy beige strands, lacking the vibrancy of typical leaves. Even more bizarre was its stillness. No matter how strong the breeze, neither the branches nor the leaves ever moved. Stranger yet, the tree bore no apparent means of reproduction. There were no flowers, fruit, seeds, or bulbs of any kind. A floral, sickly sweet aroma emanated from it, though I could not place the scent. The most baffling aspect, however, was its complete absence of movement in the wind, as if it existed outside the normal laws of nature. We had intended to conduct a fracture test, but had unfortunately left the probe back in Florida, something I now deeply regret. At first, the tree became the subject of intense local curiosity, attracting visitors and speculation from nearby residents, but public attention quickly shifted after the mysterious disappearance of Mr. Walker's neighbors, Bill and Carol Kellenbach. Not long after, Mr. Walker became increasingly reluctant to discuss the tree, avoiding our calls and eventually refusing further research. His attitude toward us shifted drastically. Where he had once been open to collaboration, even willing to accept payment in exchange for the rights to study the tree, he now urged us not to return. When we pressed him for a reason, his response was cryptic and unsettling. He insisted that the tree was alive, not in the botanical sense, but something more than that. The weight of his words lingered, though at the time I struggled to interpret what he truly meant. The final conversation I had with him still chills me to this day. When I asked for an update on the tree, his response was brief but jarring. He simply said that the tree was gone before abruptly hanging up. Concerned, our research institute dispatched a team to investigate, and what they found defied all logic. There was no sign of the tree, no stump, no remnants, no indication that it had ever existed. All that remained was a caldera-like depression in the earth, a hollow indentation where the tree had once stood. It was as if it had vanished without a trace. When questioned, Mr. Walker maintained that one day he had woken up and it was simply gone. Just as mysteriously as it had arrived, it had disappeared. He seemed resigned, almost relieved. Since then, my colleagues and I, both biologists and geologists alike, have kept a close eye on this phenomenon. Over time, similar cases have begun emerging, each following an eerily similar pattern. The first appearances were scattered along the East Coast, with sightings in Boston, Massachusetts, and Alexandria, Virginia. Then they began showing up across the country, in California and beyond. Eventually, these trees began appearing worldwide. The first confirmed international case was documented in Bologna, Italy, followed closely by an incident in Nagoya, Japan. The first one I personally investigated outside the US was in Gujarat, India. and it bore striking similarities to the tree we had examined in West Virginia. One of the most confounding details became clear as these cases multiplied. These trees did not require soil to grow. Unlike any known species, they could emerge from virtually any surface. The tree found in Nagoya had sprouted in the middle of a city street, surrounded by pavement, yet it still disappeared overnight, leaving behind no evidence of its presence beyond an unexplainable indentation in the asphalt. This baffling ability only deepened the mystery. How did these trees derive nutrients? How did they sustain themselves? Scientists have attempted to develop theories to explain them, with one of the most widely discussed being that they may belong to an ancient, previously undocumented category of resurrection plants. These are plants capable of surviving extreme periods of dormancy, requiring little to no water or nutrients, only to rapidly regenerate once conditions become favorable. While this theory is intriguing, it has its flaws. The primary issue is scale. No known resurrection plant exhibits growth of this magnitude, let alone the ability to appear and disappear seemingly overnight. Even if these trees somehow lay dormant beneath the earth, how could they have remained undetected for so long? What environmental trigger could possibly be responsible for their sudden emergence? And perhaps most disturbingly, if these trees are merely waiting, how many more of them are still hidden, biding their time beneath our feet? In the years since my first encounter with one of these trees, I have seen and studied many more. And through my research, I have been able to determine that the tree on Mr. Walker's property was what I would classify as middle-aged. This conclusion came from observing similar trees of varying sizes, from small saplings to towering specimens over 200 feet tall, rivaling the size of sequoias and redwoods, with trunks reaching nearly 75 feet around. One of the more striking characteristics of these trees, aside from their unusual morphology, was their coloration. While the first tree I encountered was gray, a fairly common color for these anomalies, they also appeared in deep shades of mauve, crimson, and violet, with occasional bright yellow specimens. Another phenomenon that became apparent during my studies was the complete aversion of animals to these trees. Birds, which are typically the most common inhabitants of trees, refuse to perch on their branches or build nests within them. Even ground-dwelling creatures like squirrels and rodents avoided them entirely. The only creatures that seemed indifferent to their presence were banana slugs, but beyond that, the forests were eerily devoid of life. Then, beginning in 2027, something new happened. A farmer in Nebraska, about an hour outside of Omaha, reported an entire grove of these trees appearing overnight on his property. This was the first recorded instance of a large grouping of them materializing together, rather than as isolated anomalies. As before, the farmer claimed he neither saw nor heard anything unusual prior to their sudden arrival. His report caught the attention of the scientific community, and our team was among those dispatched to investigate. My lab assistant, Erica, became so captivated by the case that it eventually led to her shifting her focus to geology. From there, these forests began to appear all over the world, their stunning, almost surreal appearance captured in countless photographs. Some of the formations were vast, with the largest found in a remote region of Siberia, covering nearly 4 square miles. Others were significantly smaller, such as a tiny cluster of saplings in a park in Owen Sound, Ontario, Canada, which measured only about 12 feet in diameter. One particularly remarkable forest in Finland was home to a tree that dwarfed every other known species, standing at an unfathomable 800 feet tall. This tree, the largest ever documented, was aptly named Gaia, after the primordial Greek deity known as the Mother of Hyperion. Years of studying these kaleidoscopic forests led to a series of startling discoveries. One of the most unsettling involved the way they affected local wildlife. Birds that would normally migrate through these regions began avoiding the forests entirely, never flying over them and instead veering around them by at least 2 miles in every direction. Other creatures adapted similarly. Ground-dwelling organisms, such as earthworms, beetles, and caterpillars, were seen abandoning areas where these trees had taken root, fleeing en masse. But beyond the scientific observations, a chilling amount of anecdotal evidence also began to surface. Rumors spread about people entering these forests and never returning. Initially, I dismissed these stories as exaggerated urban legends, scare tactics meant to deter people from wandering into the unknown or getting lost. But then something else happened, something I could not ignore. Not long after these forests began appearing, researchers and amateur enthusiasts alike started sending drones into them, hoping to capture footage of whatever lay within. The results were disturbingly consistent. When flown over the forests, the drones recorded nothing out of the ordinary. However, as soon as they entered the tree lines, their video feeds would abruptly cut to static. It didn't matter how skilled the pilot was, something inside these forests interfered with their ability to transmit data. Some of these feeds were even being broadcast live across social media, yet every single one ended the same way. What was even stranger was that very few of these drones were ever recovered, and the ones that were, typically found near the edges of the forests, were found in a mangled state, as if something had violently crushed them. Then, just a week ago, Erica and I were preparing to travel to Nebraska to further investigate the phenomenon, when we received a call from the farmer who had initially reported the forest on his land. His message was simple: the forest had disappeared overnight. At first, this wasn't surprising, as it aligned with the known behavior of these trees. But when I asked for more details, he told me that the trees had left behind a massive crater in their place. I didn't dwell on it much until, over the next few days, reports began coming in from around the world. The forests were vanishing. Every single one. Within days, the anomaly that had fascinated and haunted researchers for years was simply gone, leaving behind deep indentations in the earth where they had once stood. Our research had abruptly come to an end, but I had no idea that the strangest revelation was yet to come. Earlier this morning, I received an unexpected text message from Reginald Walker, urging me to call him. It had been years since we last spoke, and I wasn't sure what to expect. But when I finally got around to dialing his number in the evening, he picked up immediately. He began by apologizing for his years of silence, and I assured him there was no need. Then he got to the reason for his call. He told me that after hearing about the forests appearing and disappearing, he felt compelled to reach out. There was something I needed to know. He then asked if I was sitting down, and when I confirmed that I was, he told me something that sent a chill down my spine. He told me why he had always insisted that the tree on his property had been alive, why he had begged us not to continue our research, and then he told me the truth about what had really happened to his neighbors Bill and Carol. They weren't missing. They were dead. He had seen it happen with his own eyes. Bill had tried to burn the tree down. As soon as he struck the match, the tree retaliated, plunging one of its serpentine branches straight through his skull and draining him of his life. Carol never even had a chance to escape. Before she could react, the tree's roots came alive, wrapping around her legs and dragging her screaming into the earth, clawing at the ground as she was swallowed whole. Reginald described the horror of standing there helpless, watching as the tree absorbed them both. He never saw what happened to Bill's body after that. When the terror had subsided enough for him to go inside, he locked his doors, shut his blinds, and forced himself to sleep. By morning, there was no trace of Bill left. That was when he knew he had to get rid of the tree. When I first met Reginald Walker, I was just a young doctoral student, eager to learn, eager to explore the unknown. He was an honest man then, and he still is now. He has nothing to gain from telling me this, no reason to lie. He ended the call with one final thought: his belief that these things weren't trees at all. He had long suspected they were something else entirely. Something not of this world. And after everything I've seen, after everything I've studied, after everything I now know, I think I'm starting to believe him. My father once told me a story that has never left my mind. It wasn't just because it was the first tale he ever shared with me as a child, nor was it solely because it explained how my grandfather met his end. No, it was something else entirely, something more unsettling, People hear strange tales all the time, on TV, whispered among friends, in conversations overheard in passing. Stories of ghosts, cryptids, and things that exist where they shouldn't. Stories of ghosts, cryptids, and things that exist where they shouldn't. Most people brush them off, assuming they are just myths, misunderstandings, or the wild exaggerations of an overactive mind. That is, until something happens. Something that forces you to reconsider. Maybe it happens to you, or maybe you start hearing the same details again and again from people who couldn't possibly know one another. Suddenly the world feels much larger, much darker, and far more dangerous than you once thought. My father told me this story, and for years I didn't believe him. No matter how adamantly he swore on its truth, I always figured it was just a tall tale, an exaggeration meant to spook me. But that changed the moment I started seeing accounts online, stories nearly identical to his, coming from people in completely different places, people who had never met. That was when my skepticism faded into something else, something closer to fear. My father never had a name for it. He never used a computer, never read what the internet had labeled it. But when he spoke about it, he called it a skinwalker, a name he had learned from his grandfather, a name rooted in old Cherokee legend. One night we were out hunting, deep in the woods surrounding the Ohio dairy farm where we lived. Coyotes were a problem, and their pelts sold for $50 apiece. That was how we got by. Sometimes if we came across a deer, we would take it down too. Our landlord never minded. Fresh venison meant extra food on the table. That night, everything was unnervingly still. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just silence. We had finished our rounds and started the walk home. Since we didn't have a car or four-wheeler, we cut through the woods. It was the fastest way back. That was when we found it. Blood splattered across the trees, pooling in the grass, staining the edges of the creek. At first, we assumed a pack of coyotes had gotten desperate and taken down a deer. That wasn't unusual when food was scarce, but something wasn't right. Predators don't waste their kills. Wolves, coyotes, even feral dogs. They pick off the weak, kill quickly, and take what they need. What we saw was different. 3 deer ripped apart, their remains scattered like something had been playing with them. A severed head here, a torso yards away, limbs torn and discarded like they meant nothing. This wasn't hunting. This was something else. My father told me to go home. He was sure we were dealing with a pack of wild dogs, too unpredictable, too dangerous for me to be around. But there was no way I was walking 2 miles alone in the dark with nothing but a .22 rifle and a pocket knife. I was 13, and my father had the shotgun. If he was staying, so was I. It took some convincing, but he let me stay. We followed the blood trail, which wasn't difficult. It stretched deep into the woods. Either whatever did this had dragged a deer for miles, or something much worse had happened. But what truly unsettled me was the look on my father's face. He had fought in wars, faced men far more dangerous than any wild animal. Yet in that moment, he looked afraid. As we continued, the forest changed. First, a rustling, then an eruption of movement. Birds took off, crashing into branches in their panic. Deer burst from the undergrowth, bolting past us. A pack of coyotes streaked by, their glowing eyes reflecting in the dim light. We nearly fired until we realized they weren't hunting. They were running. And they weren't the only ones. Rabbits, foxes, squirrels, even wild hogs. Every living thing in the woods was fleeing. They were all going in the same direction. Away. That should have been the moment we turned back, but we didn't. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was instinct. Either way, we kept moving forward, not realizing the nightmare we were about to step into. We should have realized sooner that whatever we were tracking wasn't something meant to be found, nor something we could kill. Even now, I can't understand why we didn't just turn back. Maybe we were too curious, or maybe it was just in my father's nature to charge toward danger rather than away from it. I knew enough about the things he had done during the war to trust that staying by his side was my best chance. We finally emerged into an open valley that was usually a soy field, though out of season it was nothing but flat dirt. That was where we saw the tracks. The animals that had fled the woods had trampled everything in their path, but in the bloodied earth ahead, not a single step had been taken. It was as if whatever had done this had left its work untouched, waiting for us to see it. The tracks themselves were shallow, suggesting the thing couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but that didn't mean much. Even a small predator can be deadly if it's fast enough. A bobcat barely pushing 40 pounds can tear out a man's throat if it catches him off guard. The fact that this thing was light only meant it was fast, and that it wouldn't be easy to hit. We followed the tracks, and soon enough they led us to an old schoolhouse perched on a hill. Half of it had been destroyed by a tornado years ago, leaving it abandoned. Occasionally we'd find homeless people using it for shelter, or addicts looking for a place to shoot up. That's what we assumed this was. Maybe just some sick kid high on something. But that assumption didn't last long. When we were about 50 yards away, we heard a sound. A screech, two separate tones at once, one high and sharp, the other a deep, guttural growl. Both sounds coming from the same throat. We moved in closer, stopping at 20 yards, when a different noise reached us. It reminded me of paper being slowly torn apart while something sloshed water back and forth in a bucket. My father knelt down and whispered that I had to stay right behind him. He explained that whatever it was alone, and when a predator is cornered, it will fight with everything it has. He figured it was a feral dog, probably rabid. The plan was simple: sneak up on it, shoot until it stopped moving, then slit its throat. If it got to him first, I was to do whatever I had to in order to get it off. We moved forward, me just slightly to his side so I could see what we were dealing with. I wish I never had. It was hunched over a carcass, peeling off strips of flesh and tossing aside what it didn't care to eat. Blood glistened in the moonlight, covering the bricks beneath it. It was pale, almost ghostly, its form human-like, but undeniably wrong. Its arms and legs were shaped like ours, but it crouched like a primate, its long fingers ending in sharp claws. My father hesitated. It was too human. He wasn't about to shoot unless he was sure, so he made a mistake. He cleared his throat, trying to get it to turn around. The moment that sound left his mouth, everything stopped. I have never before or since heard true silence like that. It lasted only a couple of seconds, but it was long enough to make my stomach drop. Then the creature turned. The instant it moved, the night erupted again, the sound of a shrill, unnatural scream cutting through the still air as it lunged at my father. He fired, but I think he missed. If he hit, it didn't care. It tore into him like he was nothing, ripping at his flesh with inhuman force. I started firing my .22, hitting it at point-blank range, but the bullets did nothing. I managed 5 shots before I abandoned the gun and swung at it with the butt of the rifle. It didn't even react. It was too focused on my father, its claws digging deeper, peeling skin from his chest before moving upward. It ripped out his throat, tore off his nose, and gouged his eyes. Then it scalped him and dug further. I stood there frozen as it tore away the lower half of his jaw, as it pulled at his ribs like it was cracking open a feast. I don't know exactly how it happened, but somehow my father's knife ended up embedded in its shoulder, and suddenly my father, what was left of him, was on my back. I was running, and I was faster than I had ever been in my life. It chased me, screeching, snapping branches in its path like matchsticks. I ran blindly, heading toward my landlord's house, the only place nearby. Even that was half a mile away. I never looked back, not once. Finally, I tripped, skidding into gravel, and looked up to see my landlord and his friends drinking around a fire. I screamed and they ran to me, demanding to know what happened. I begged them to call an ambulance, but my landlord stopped, his face paling as he stared. "What is that on your back?" he asked. Then I realized. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the remains of my father. Barely more than a tattered flannel shirt wrapped around a torso, nothing below the waist. Suddenly the screeching started again. My landlord yanked me backward, and in the struggle, what was left of my father fell to the ground. I fought against him, sobbing, desperate to believe there was something left to save. But the truth was undeniable. My father had been gone long before I ever picked him up, and all I had done was carry a corpse back home. My landlord had to physically throw me inside before I stopped resisting. Once we were in, he and his friends bolted the doors, grabbed their guns, and turned on every light in the house. He kept demanding answers, asking me what had happened, but I could barely process it myself. Still, he understood enough to know that something was out there, something dangerous. Someone called the cops, but 15 minutes was the soonest they could arrive. We didn't have that long. We saw it then, stepping into the firelight outside. No one could make sense of it. One of them muttered that it looked like an ape. Before anyone could react, something crashed through the window. Everyone fired, but when the dust settled, we realized it hadn't been the creature. It had been my landlord's dog, or at least what was left of it. The head and legs were missing. We scrambled to barricade the doors and windows, shoving furniture against anything that could be breached. Then we heard something in the garage. One of the men cursed under his breath, realizing the doors had been left open. The sounds of metal and glass being torn apart filled the house. We pushed the couch and the TV against the door leading to the garage, adding as much weight as we could. The noise inside continued for a while, violent and erratic, before going quiet. Not silent, but different. We could hear it moving. The men checked their weapons. Someone handed me a pistol, and I cocked the hammer just as a window upstairs shattered. This time the screech was even louder. It didn't fade. It didn't echo. It was inside. We rushed to the staircase, reaching the door at the same moment it did. It forced the door open just enough to get its hand through, but one of the men shoved a shotgun barrel against its wrist and pulled. The blast took the hand clean off, but that only made it angrier. It started slamming into the door, clawing wildly, and though we held our ground, the wood wouldn't last long. Someone yelled for us to duck just as a shotgun went off, splintering the upper half of the door. My ears rang and the air filled with dust and debris. In the chaos, the creature was gone. I don't know where it went after that. The police finally arrived, but by then the fight was over. I sat there, staring at the shattered door, unable to move until the sun was up. They took me to the hospital, but I barely spoke. Not for days. When I finally returned home, I started working for my landlord. We never talked about what happened that night, never acknowledged it beyond necessity. Years later, before I left for the army, my landlord sat me down with a drink, and I finally asked what the police had told him. The official story was simple: a wild animal attack. Maybe a wolf, maybe a bear that had wandered too far north. I asked him about the hand. At first he looked confused, then his face changed. He told me it never made it to the station. The officer transporting it crashed his car into a tree and died on impact. The hand was gone, likely taken by scavengers. When the police acknowledged it at all, they claimed it had been nothing more than the paw of a bear that looked strangely human. I never spoke to my landlord again. Some said he had debts and skipped town, but I knew better. As for me, I never set foot in those woods again, not even if the entire U.S. Army was backing me up. That was everything my father ever told me about that night. But there was one problem. He lied. Years later, when my mother died, I think my father finally felt he had nothing left to lose. He went back to those woods. He never came out. The FBI got involved, but it was all for show. I knew they weren't really looking. It wasn't until I got an agent drunk and slipped him some cash that he admitted the truth. They got calls about those woods every year. People went missing there all the time. That was all he would say. But before he left, he wrote something on a napkin and slid it across the table. At first, I didn't understand. Not until I searched the name online. I wish I had never looked. As it turns out, there are hundreds of stories just like my father's, some accompanied by drawings or even photographs. The details may change, but everyone agrees on one thing. It's still out there, and nothing on this earth can stop it. Usually I begin these stories with some sort of reflection on police work, but today all I can say is this. Life is a cruel and unforgiving thing. It was a dreary October evening, the kind where the rain seeps into your bones, and I had recently rejoined the homicide division after taking an extended break. It was a unit I once felt at home in, a place where I thrived, but certain past events had made it necessary for me to step away for the sake of my own sanity. That being said, after years of dealing with some of the most heinous crimes imaginable, oddly enough, murder had become almost routine. More than anything, though, I knew it would serve as a distraction, because at this point, I'd much rather occupy my thoughts with tracking down a killer than be haunted by the ever-growing number of monsters that seemed to be creeping into my life. As I pulled up to the apartment complex, a strange thought crossed my mind. How could a place so full of life be so often centered around death? The way the officers and forensic specialists moved within the crime scene reminded me of an ant colony, each person carrying out their role independently, yet all working toward the same objective, uncovering the truth and identifying the culprit. I had hoped that the late hour would mean fewer prying eyes, but as I surveyed the area, I realized that the morbidly curious tenants had gathered nonetheless. It was understandable. Murder wasn't something people witnessed every day. It evoked fear, fascination, and a strange sense of curiosity all at once, a departure from the mundanity of their normal lives that made it impossible to ignore. Still, I couldn't help but wish they would just stay inside and spare themselves the trauma, because once you see a dead body, that image never truly leaves you. Scanning the crowd of law enforcement personnel, I searched for a familiar face, and it didn't take long before I spotted one. Officer Ryan, who acknowledged me with a wave and a grin. He stood among a group of patrol officers, his signature smile still intact despite the scars that remained from his run-in with the hermit, and his once broken nose had been fixed to look good as new. As I approached, he greeted me casually, asking how things were going, to which I responded with a yawn, making a remark about how inconvenient it was that murder seemed to happen during regular working hours. One of the officers beside him, Bailey, regarded me with a look of mild surprise before blurting out a question about my return to homicide, mentioning that he thought I had sworn off the division after what happened. With a nervous chuckle, I dismissed the idea, explaining that it was merely a break and that I had always planned to come back. Shifting my focus to the crime at hand, I asked what they knew about the victim, prompting Ryan to sigh before motioning for me to follow him toward the scene. To say the sight before me was horrific would have been an understatement. The man's face and chest had been crushed, large chunks of flesh had been torn from his neck, and his right arm appeared to have been shattered against the pavement. The level of mutilation was grotesque, the brutality behind the attack sending a wave of unease through me, making it difficult not to gag. Ryan began his rundown of the case, stating the obvious, that the victim had suffered severe blunt force trauma, along with cuts and bruises consistent with a violent struggle. No witnesses had come forward yet, but the individual who had placed the 911 call was waiting to be questioned. Kneeling beside the body, I took a closer look, my mind immediately jumping to one conclusion. This had to be personal. No one brutalizes a body like this unless there's something deeply personal involved. Even if the intent had been to obscure the victim's identity, the level of destruction seemed excessive. Ryan suggested a possible robbery gone wrong, speculating that an argument over valuables could have led to the attack. But as I checked the victim's pockets, that theory quickly lost traction. His wallet and keys were still there. Flipping through the contents of the wallet, I found an ID identifying him as Ernie Garrison, a 58-year-old man. While a formal identification would still be necessary, we could at least put a probable name to the face. I signaled an evidence collector to secure the items before continuing my inspection. As I examined the area around his neck and trapezius, my stomach dropped. and my voice came out sharp as I called for the crime scene photographer to take a look. Embedded in the victim's flesh were 3 yellowed human teeth, and what disturbed me even more was the state of decomposition around them. The body had been dead for at most an hour, yet the skin surrounding the teeth was already rotting while the rest of the corpse remained intact. A sickening feeling settled in my gut as I glanced at the photographer, whose expression mirrored my own. Revulsion mixed with confusion. Neither of us were medical experts, but we both understood enough to know that human tissue didn't decay that quickly, and it certainly didn't happen in such a localized manner. A creeping sense of unease took hold of me, my mind conjuring possibilities I didn't want to entertain. Had the tall woman done this, or was something else at play? Forcing myself to regain composure, I instructed my team to have the teeth removed and checked for any DNA matches in the system. Just as I was finishing my examination of the body, a faint buzzing sound reached my ears. Instinctively, I reached for my phone, only to realize it wasn't coming from me. I scanned the area, searching for the source of the noise, until I noticed a dim blue glow flickering near a trash bin. As I made my way over, I spotted a phone lying on the ground, speckled with tiny flecks of blood on its case. Pressing the home button revealed a lock screen with a background image of a man who bore a strong resemblance to a slightly younger Roger Garrison, posing with a dog. A single missed call stood out in the notification bar, and with a quick swipe I discovered something interesting. Mr. Garrison didn't use a passcode. Even more intriguing was a text message from someone saved under the contact name Asshole that caught my attention immediately, making me mutter to myself about the sheer improbability of this being a coincidence. If the victim was in contact with someone he clearly had a problem with at the exact time of his death, there was no way I could ignore that detail. Without wasting any time, I walked the phone over to an evidence collector, instructing her to keep it secure back at the station for me. After making my rounds and discussing my findings with the other detectives, it was time to speak with the 911 caller, Miss Ava Bronstein. I found her standing outside her apartment door, her hands wringing together as she tried to compose herself. Introducing myself, I eased into the conversation by asking her to recount the details of the original emergency call. The slight tremble in her voice made it clear she was still shaken. She explained that she had been watching TV when she suddenly heard a loud banging sound outside. At first, she assumed it was one of the downstairs neighbors working on something, and though she found it strange given the late hour, she had chosen to mind her own business. However, the noise continued, becoming persistent enough that it must have annoyed Ernie as well. She recalled hearing him shout in frustration, threatening to kick someone's you-know-what, before slamming his door. Moments later, the commotion escalated. She could hear him outside, screaming profanities and demanding that someone get off of him. That was when she decided to call the police, but after she hung up, an eerie silence followed. I pressed further, asking if she had seen anything when she looked outside. She nodded, explaining that once everything went quiet, she had cautiously peered out her window, only to be met with the horrifying sight of Ernie's lifeless body sprawled out on the pavement, covered in blood. No one else was around him. I questioned whether she had stepped outside to check if he was still alive, but her response was blunt. She was 74 years old and had grown up in Brooklyn. She knew better than to hover around a dead body. I couldn't argue with that. Shifting the conversation, I asked if she had any idea who Ernie had gone out to confront, or if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to harm him. She thought for a moment before shaking her head, explaining that while Ernie had mentioned issues with one of the neighbors, he had never specified who. As far as she knew, he didn't have any major enemies. Sure, he had a temper, but outside of that one dispute, he never mentioned ongoing conflicts with anyone else. I then asked if he had any family or close friends we could contact, but she revealed that he had no children, no wife, no siblings, and that his parents had passed away years ago. Aside from herself, she wasn't sure if he even spoke to anyone regularly. While I didn't want to outright dismiss her statement, it was hard to believe that a man with seemingly no ties had been murdered in such a brutal fashion. Still, Between the phone, the teeth embedded in his flesh, and this new lead on his neighbor, we had a solid base to work from. As our conversation wrapped up, she made one final comment that stuck with me. Ernie had been a fighter, and he always carried a golden pocket knife with his initials engraved on it. She was certain that whoever had done this to him would be left with scars. That small detail lodged itself in my mind as I finally made my way back to the station. The first thing I wanted to do was check that phone. Practically sprinting to the evidence room, I retrieved the device, feeling a surge of anticipation as I unlocked it and scrolled through its contents. Officer Ryan and a couple of other detectives gathered around my desk as I read through what appeared to be a heated text exchange between Ernie and his neighbor Alan Wong. The messages painted a clear picture. They had been arguing about the loud banging sounds. Mr. Wong insisted he wasn't the one making the noise and strongly urged Ernie not to go outside to investigate. Their back and forth escalated, culminating in Ernie deciding to confront whoever was responsible, which ultimately led to his death. This was huge. While the lab results for the DNA evidence would take time, we now had a direct link to a potential witness. If we could determine who had been outside at the time of the murder, the DNA results would simply be the final nail in the coffin. Either way, the next step was obvious: speaking with Alan Wong. Once we had his name, locating his apartment was easy, and convincing him to talk wasn't much of a challenge either. A simple reminder that withholding information in an active murder investigation could land him in serious trouble was enough to get him to cooperate. The short ride downtown was uneventful, but once we arrived at the interrogation room, I began sizing him up immediately. There were no visible cuts or bruises on him, no bloodstains. For a crime that violent, you would expect there to be some kind of sign. Yet, despite his seemingly clean appearance, one thing was clear. He was nervous. His forehead was slick with sweat, and his eyes darted around the room, shifting anxiously as if he was waiting for something to jump out at him. I decided to start off easy, attempting to break the tension by casually asking how he was doing. His response came with a nervous chuckle, an acknowledgement that it was a ridiculous question given the situation, followed by an impatient request to get straight to the point. Fair enough. I got right to it, asking how he knew Ernie Garrison. He explained that he did repair work, and at some point Ernie had asked him to help fix up his car, since he assumed it would be cheaper than going to a professional. I pressed further, questioning whether they had continued speaking after that. He gave a half-hearted shrug and admitted that there had been a minor dispute between them, but downplayed its significance. That caught my attention. A man ends up dead right after an argument with a neighbor, a classic scenario. The pieces were coming together in my head. I leaned in slightly and asked him outright, what exactly was this dispute about? Alan leaned forward, frustration visible on his face as he explained that the dispute had been about payment for his work. He considered himself a reasonable guy, willing to give Ernie a better deal than he would have gotten elsewhere, but that still wasn't enough. Ernie had tried to lowball him, expecting nearly free labor just because they were neighbors. When Alan finally threatened to take him to court over it, Ernie begrudgingly paid up, but that wasn't the end of their problems. After that, Ernie began to complain about everything. Noise, Alan's dog, even going so far as to claim he thought he smelled drugs coming from the apartment. It was clear he was trying to get Alan evicted. I acknowledged that it sounded like a rough situation and asked if that meant he had truly hated the guy. Alan scoffed at the word, explaining that hate was too strong. Sure, they weren't friends, but he never wished harm on Ernie. It was all just a bunch of petty nonsense in his eyes. That was fair enough, but the problem now was that Ernie was dead, and I needed Alan to tell me in his own words what he thought had happened. The shift in his demeanor was immediate. His foot began tapping, his breath hitched, and when he finally spoke, his voice was strained. He stammered that he had no idea, that he just knew the guy had been killed and that it was horrible, but he had nothing else to add. I didn't believe that for a second. It didn't make sense. Alan had been the last person to communicate with Ernie, and we knew Ernie had left his apartment intending to confront someone, likely Alan himself. Given the well-documented animosity between them, it was impossible to ignore the possibility that this was more than just an unfortunate coincidence. Alan shook his head, but something in his expression told me there was more he wanted to say. I leaned in slightly, making it clear that if he was holding something back, now was the time to come clean. I reminded him that if he knew something and was keeping it from us, he was playing a dangerous game. If this murder somehow got pinned on him, he'd have to rely on my word when I told the prosecution whether he had cooperated or not. I gave him a choice. He could either start talking or let himself sink deeper into suspicion. His reaction was explosive. Slamming his hand on the table, he jabbed a finger in my direction, his voice rising as he insisted he had nothing to do with the murder. He was well aware of how serious this was and didn't need me telling him. His frustration boiled over into a loud groan, and his hands flew to his head as tears formed in his eyes. He muttered that the whole situation was messed up, and that if he was a murder suspect, the last thing he wanted was to tell the truth and sound ridiculous. That got my attention. He wasn't just scared, he was panicking. I decided to give him space, standing up and making my way to the door. Before stepping out, I turned back and told him that I didn't care how ridiculous it sounded. He just needed to tell me the truth. I left him alone to think for 20 minutes, hoping that when I came back, I'd get a confession. Maybe an admission that he had snapped and attacked Ernie in a fit of rage, possibly with the help of an accomplice. It wouldn't be the first time a simple neighborhood dispute had turned deadly. I had been expecting something horrible but easy, a straightforward case of violence. Instead, what I got was something much more disturbing. When I returned, Alan finally spoke, but what he told me defied all logic. He claimed that he had been outside late at night throwing away some trash when he noticed something across the street, something he refused to call anything other than an abomination. According to him, the moment they locked eyes, the thing charged at him, and his only option was to run back inside and hide. He described hearing loud, forceful bangs against his door as the creature tried to break through. That was when Ernie must have heard the noise and assumed it was Alan. Despite Alan's frantic attempts to convince him to stay inside, Ernie wouldn't listen. And then, moments later, he was dead. I asked him why he hadn't just told Ernie what he had actually seen, but his response was bitter laughter. He knew no one would have believed him. He wouldn't have expected even his closest friend to believe something that insane, let alone someone who despised him. Ernie would have gone outside no matter what Alan had said. The entire thing sounded absurd. I could already imagine the other officers outside the room shaking their heads and trying to suppress their laughter. A monster in the darkness attacking a man? Yeah, right. Except, yeah, right. The way Alan spoke, the way his hands trembled as he described what he saw, the genuine terror behind his eyes, it wasn't the look of a man telling a lie. It was the same look I had seen before. It was a look I knew all too well. Even though I pressed him for more details, it was clear he had told me everything he knew, so I let him go. I told him we'd stay in touch, but deep down I knew I'd never see him again. He wasn't our guy. And yet, I still clung to the possibility that this wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it was just a crazed human being. Maybe we were dealing with a psychopath, not some otherworldly entity. I needed to believe that. I had to. Weeks passed before the DNA results finally came back, and what they revealed only made things worse. The teeth found embedded in Ernie's flesh, no matches in any database. The rest of the evidence, nothing conclusive. We had also taken a deeper look into Alan, but every search only proved his innocence. No trace of his DNA was found at the scene. No indications that he had hired someone else to do the job. His home computer history showed he had been browsing the internet at the time of the attack, further backing up his claim that he had been inside. Even when we reviewed the security cameras in the area, we found nothing. No clear footage of a suspect, no signs of anyone coming or going that could explain what had happened. If Alan had somehow been involved, there was no hard evidence to prove it. Our two best leads had dried up, and before long, Ernie Garrison's case became just another cold file in an ever-growing stack of unsolved murders. The days dragged on without any new breakthroughs, and I knew we had to try something different. I pushed the chief to hold a press conference, hoping that a public appeal might lead to new information. If someone out there recognized the type of injuries Ernie had sustained, or if they knew anything about his past that we had overlooked, it might give us the missing pieces we desperately needed. We needed answers, and if this really was the work of something beyond human understanding, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what those answers would be. The initial wave of tips that came in was, unsurprisingly, a waste of time. Most of them were just people throwing out random names, maybe a shady uncle, a bitter ex, or some disgruntled coworker. A few of the calls were outright bizarre, with people suggesting things like a strange set of stairs in the woods, or skinwalkers being responsible. I didn't even know what to make of those theories. I'd heard stories about both, and to put it simply, I had no interest in getting involved with either. The point was, we weren't making any real progress, just spinning our wheels chasing dead ends. That was until I got a late-night call at the office and immediately recognized the voice on the other end of the line. She sounded hesitant, as if she was unsure about even making the call in the first place. The nervousness in her tone was clear as she asked if she was speaking to Detective Smith. I confirmed, asking who was calling, and she finally identified herself. Maria Alvarez, a nurse at the old hospital. She reminded me that we had spoken in the parking lot after what happened. The moment she mentioned the old hospital, I felt a chill run through me. A flood of memories came rushing back, most notably the face of the hermit, which sent a reflexive glance toward the air vent above me, just making sure there was nothing lurking inside. I steadied myself and responded, telling her I remembered her, then asked how she had been. She sighed, telling me she was managing. She admitted that something I had said to her back then had stuck with her, shifting the way she viewed the world. She had been struggling with the realization that everything felt a little more terrifying now, as if the world had changed overnight. I didn't know what to say other than that I was sorry to hear it. She brushed it off, saying it was tolerable, before quickly pivoting to the reason she had called. She had seen my press conference, and something about it had triggered a thought, one that she couldn't shake. The more she mulled over what had happened to Ernie Garrison, the more convinced she became that she might have an idea of what had gone down. I asked her what she meant, and for a brief moment there was silence. I could hear movement on the other end of the line before she finally whispered, "Technically, I'm not supposed to be sharing this because of patient confidentiality." That got my attention. She went on to explain that not long ago someone had come into the hospital with injuries that bore striking similarities to Ernie's. The man had suffered severe head and chest trauma, and most notably bite marks with rotting skin surrounding the wounds. The staff had questioned him about what had happened, but all he would say was that some animal had jumped him in the woods. At the time, they had all found it strange, particularly because the bite marks looked undeniably human. But after our last conversation, after I had told her that real monsters existed, she started to put the pieces together. What if the man had been attacked by something similar and had been too afraid to talk about it? The pattern was emerging, and I could feel my mind racing to connect the dots. I asked if he was still alive and where I could find him. She confirmed that he was and provided me with his name, Leonard Houston. She said she would send over his details and maybe, if I was lucky, he'd be willing to shed some light on what had happened. This was exactly what I had been waiting for. A solid lead, something tangible to chase. I thanked her, but before ending the call, I had to ask why she had chosen to come forward. Why take this risk? Why not just leave it alone? Her answer was simple. She told me that because I had shared the truth with her, she felt like she owed me some truth in return. That was enough for me. I told her that if she ever needed anything, even just someone to talk to when the weight of it all became too much, I would always be there. With that, the call ended, and I shifted my focus to my next move. Normally I would have had another detective accompany me to meet this guy, but this was far from a normal situation. If I was going to deal with something outside the realm of logic, I needed someone I could trust. Only one name came to mind. Officer Ryan was ecstatic when I called him. The moment we had all of Leonard Houston's details, we set out to track him down. Despite the gravity of the case, the drive over was filled with laughter. That was Ryan's effect on people. Here we were, investigating a gruesome murder, and yet all we could talk about was what anime he was currently watching and whether or not aliens had visited Earth. Ryan had always been my grounding force, keeping me from losing myself to the darkness of this job. Without him, I had no doubt that I would have gone insane long ago. His presence kept me calm, even as we pulled up to the run-down apartment complex where Leonard Houston supposedly lived. The sound of a television playing inside told us someone was home, but despite knocking multiple times, we heard no movement. Finally, growing impatient, we decided to stop being polite. Raising our voices, we yelled, "Police!" That got a reaction. The man who finally opened the door looked like he had been dragged out of a deep sleep or a drunken stupor. Pale and thin, he reeked of cigarettes, and the couch behind him was littered with empty beer cans. The moment he saw us, he threw his hands up, immediately going on the defensive, insisting that whatever we thought he had done, he was innocent because he had been busy that night. I cleared my throat, holding back a sigh. This was already shaping up to be an interesting conversation. I asked if he was Leonard Houston. He confirmed that he was, albeit with a look of annoyance. That was good enough for me. I reassured him that he wasn't in any trouble, introduced myself and Ryan, and explained that we were looking into something and thought he might be able to help. His response was a scoff, followed by a dry remark. "Boy, do I look like a snitch to you?" Officer Ryan, ever the natural at breaking down people's walls, quickly chimed in, telling Leonard that this wasn't about being a snitch. If anything, he had the chance to be a hero. Something terrible had happened, and we believed he might have the key to righting a wrong. That seemed to give Leonard pause, and after a moment of contemplation, he gestured for us to come inside. He offered us a seat, but one glance at the couch, littered with beer cans and what looked like mold, had both of us opting to remain standing. I wasted no time getting to the point, telling him that we had a reliable source who informed us he had been hospitalized not too long ago with some serious injuries. I asked him directly what had happened. He was immediately defensive, demanding to know who told us, before giving a casual excuse about a night hike gone wrong. Some animal, probably a coyote with mange, had attacked him. That was all. I raised an eyebrow and asked if that included a coyote with human-shaped teeth that caused the flesh around his wounds to rot. He shrugged and lit up a cigarette, dismissing it with a lazy guess so. Lot of weird shit out there in them woods. I glanced at Officer Ryan, who mirrored my unimpressed expression. I turned back to Leonard, my tone firm, as I reminded him that a man was dead. If he had seen something that could help us figure out who or what had done it, then I needed him to be more honest than some coyote with mange. His posture stiffened, the underlying tension that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly snapping into something more volatile. He reminded me that I was in his house, and if he said he hadn't seen anything, then that was the end of it. I refused to back down. I told him point blank that we both knew he was lying. Whatever he had seen, whatever had happened to him, it wasn't as simple as a wild animal attack. I reassured him that I understood if it was something strange, something beyond comprehension, but we needed his help. That was when something shifted in his eyes. Not just defensiveness, but genuine fear. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as he muttered that maybe some things weren't meant to be spoken about, that maybe some things were better left forgotten. He had seen things in his life, but that night had changed everything. He realized there were horrors in this world that no one was ready to believe in, and if he had any sense, he wouldn't drag anyone else into them. So, as far as he was concerned, it was a coyote. That was his story, and he wasn't changing it. I shot Ryan another look. This time he knew what it meant. I was silently asking him to do his thing. Without missing a beat, Ryan took a step forward, placing a hand on Leonard's shoulder before glancing at a framed photo on the wall. He pointed to it and asked if the little girl in the picture was his daughter. Leonard nodded, his expression softening for the first time. He told us she was about to turn 6. Ryan smiled and said she was adorable, mentioning that he had always wanted a kid of his own, before casually asking why she wasn't there with him. Leonard gave a vague answer about issues with the mother, but Ryan wasn't letting him off that easily. Dropping all pretense of police work, he told Leonard to forget about the badge for a second. This was just a job. He was still a person first. He told him that there was no judgment, no official statement, just two men talking. He wanted to know what was really going on, and like clockwork, the Barry fucking Ryan effect took hold. Leonard cracked. He opened up about how his life had spiraled ever since his encounter in the woods. He had tried to keep moving forward, but the fear, the nightmares, the memories, he couldn't shake them. He stopped working, started drinking, and before long his marriage crumbled. He kept the truth bottled up, knowing that if he ever spoke about what had really happened, people would call him crazy. Even if someone did believe him, he couldn't stomach the idea of dragging anyone else into the nightmare that had ruined his life. He had lost everything. His home, his stability, and worst of all, the ability to be in his daughter's life. And maybe, deep down, that was the way it had to be. Maybe isolation was the only way to keep the darkness from spreading. I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pity for him. This was the kind of fear the chief had warned me about, the kind that seeped into every aspect of a person's life, warping them until they were just a hollow shell of who they once were. Leonard had been broken by whatever had happened to him, and the world had simply left him behind. The conversation eventually shifted back to his daughter, and Ryan hit him with a question that cut straight through whatever remained of his defenses. If we were here, telling him that we believed him, that we were willing to do something about it, then as a father, wouldn't he want to help us make the world safer for his little girl? There was a long silence. He lit another cigarette, took a deep drag, and nodded. And then, finally, he told us everything. He described how he had been walking through the woods late at night when he started hearing a strange, rhythmic banging sound, like something repeatedly slamming a sledgehammer against a tree. At first, he had thought about tracking down the source, but as the sound grew louder and more erratic, paranoia set in. Something about it felt wrong. He decided to leave, but he didn't make it far before something blindsided him. He described it as being hit by a battering ram, knocking him clean off his feet. In the darkness, he couldn't make out many details, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't human. He said it was lumpy in shape, with an elongated head that made it tower over him, and then it started attacking. He could feel its teeth tearing into his skin, its hands smashing his face in. He knew he wouldn't survive if he didn't fight back. He reached for the pistol he carried and fired a shot directly into its torso. The thing let out a low, guttural groan before stumbling backward. That was all he needed. He scrambled to his feet and ran. Someone eventually found him wandering the road in a daze, covered in blood. He passed out on the way to the hospital. When he woke up, a nurse had been by his bedside, asking what had happened. He had considered telling the truth for a fleeting moment. But then he looked at her, at the genuine concern in her eyes, and he realized there was no point. No one would believe him. No one should believe him, so he stuck to his lie. A coyote. That was all it had been. Ryan and I listened in silence as he relived the worst night of his life. When he was finished, he gave us the exact location where it had happened. The trail he had been hiking was only a few miles from where Ernie Garrison had been killed. That couldn't be a coincidence. By the time we were wrapping up, his entire body was trembling, his voice cracking as he repeatedly muttered the same phrase over and over again. Never go back. Stay away. And honestly, I wasn't sure if he was saying it to himself or to us. We stayed with him until he had calmed down, doing our best to reassure him that we would take what he had told us and do everything in our power to make sure no one else suffered the same fate. As we reached the door, he stopped us one last time, his expression hollow. He told us that whatever we were planning to do, if we went looking for a nightmare, we were damn sure going to find one. He told us to stay safe. We gave him a nod and walked out. The path forward was clear now. The biggest question left was whether we were dealing with a human or something else entirely. But one thing was certain: we needed to go into those woods. We had barely sat down in my car to discuss our next move when a call came through the radio. Another murder, this one on the edge of the city. When I heard the details of the crime, my stomach dropped. A mother and her child, killed as brutally as Ernie Garrison. I felt a deep rage build inside me, a weight of grief and fury pressing down on my chest. My voice was barely steady as I responded with a simple, "On it." Without another word, I floored the gas, speeding into the night. When we arrived at the crime scene, the area was already swarming with cops. Because the murder had taken place near the city border, officers from our neighboring jurisdiction had shown up as well, each department trying to figure out whose case this was. My eyes scanned the crowd, and then I saw him. Under any other circumstances, I would have greeted him with a smile, maybe even cracked a joke to ease the tension. But this wasn't any other case. I locked eyes with him, my voice low and steady as I asked the only question that mattered. What the hell happened? Detective Michael Christian looked at me and let out a heavy sigh before saying that this one was bad. So bad that it felt as if the devil himself had a hand in it. He motioned for Officer Ryan and me to follow him into the house, and the moment we stepped inside, I could already tell this was going to be one of those cases that stayed with me. The first thing that caught my attention was the state of the front door. It had been broken down, not in the way you'd expect from a typical forced entry, but as if something large had repeatedly bashed against it, splintering the wood until it gave way. There was a hole just big enough for a person to crawl through, but the amount of force needed to create it wasn't something I could easily explain. As we moved carefully through the house, we had to watch our steps. Various objects were strewn across the floor, making it look as if a struggle had taken place. Detective Christian threw out theories, wondering if it was a robbery gone wrong, but even he wasn't convinced. And when we reached the upstairs bedroom, all those initial theories crumbled. The sight before us made it clear that this wasn't just a burglary that had taken a violent turn. This was something much more twisted. I won't go into the details, but the similarities to Ernie Garrison's murder were undeniable. The brutality, the sheer level of destruction inflicted on a mother and her child. It was something beyond human cruelty. Detective Christian was saying something about a possible personal vendetta, about someone trying to stage this as a random attack, but I wasn't listening anymore. My thoughts were drowning me. The world around me seemed to fade, and all that remained were the two lifeless bodies before me, their vacant eyes silently screaming questions I couldn't answer. Why hadn't I solved this case sooner? Why did they have to be victims of my failure? Why wasn't I good enough to stop this from happening? My body tensed and sweat formed on my brow. It felt as if the air was getting thinner, my lungs struggling to pull in oxygen as my mind spiraled further into self-blame. Why? And then, just as I felt myself slipping into that darkness, a voice broke through. A firm but familiar grip landed on my shoulder, pulling me back up to the surface. My breath hitched as I turned, meeting the worried gaze of Officer Ryan. Detective Christian stood beside him, confusion evident on his face, but Ryan's expression was one of pure concern. He asked if I was okay. I forced myself to nod, muttering that I just needed some air before making my way out of the house, Ryan following closely behind. I walked until I found a quiet spot away from the chaos, leaning against a wall as I tried to compose myself. Ryan wasn't far, his eyes watching me carefully. After a moment, he asked what was really going on. He pointed out that I hadn't reacted like this at the previous crime scene. I struggled for an answer, settling on the excuse that maybe the stress had finally caught up with me, that the weight of everything had hit all at once. He wasn't buying it. He asked if there was something I wasn't telling him. I looked at him, but stayed silent. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before shifting his gaze toward the woods. And then, in a completely unexpected turn, He told me something personal. His wife was pregnant. I blinked. That was the last thing I had expected him to say. I congratulated him, genuinely happy for him, but his expression remained serious. He said he was excited, that he had always wanted to be a dad, but the news had also made him reflect a lot on the risks we were taking. I told him that was normal, that every dad-to-be goes through that, especially in our line of work. But he shook his head, saying this was different. It wasn't just about being a cop. It was about the things we had seen, the things we had fought. He admitted that after dealing with the hermit and everything else, he had started questioning how far we were willing to go. I asked him what he meant. He told me he wanted to be there for his child's first steps, their first words, their graduation, their wedding, and he wanted me there too. He wanted our kids to grow up together, to laugh, to play, to come to each other for advice. He told me that he had seen the way I had fought to protect Lucas, and he knew I had a father's instinct buried somewhere inside me. But then he asked a question I didn't have an answer for. How likely was it that we'd actually make it that far when we were out here chasing demons? I didn't know what to say. He nodded, saying that eventually, luck runs out. He reminded me that the detectives taking over this case would do their job, and they'd probably do it well. But we both knew where this was heading. He told me point blank that I was his best friend, outside of his wife, of course. He told me he wasn't going to push me on whatever was weighing on my mind, but he was asking me as a friend to really think about how far I was willing to go, to consider my limits. And he was right. I needed to start thinking about how much more of this I could take. His words would stick with me for a long time, but at that moment, I couldn't walk away. I needed to see this case through. It wasn't long before Detective Christian came outside and informed us that this case officially fell under their jurisdiction, meaning we wouldn't be taking the lead. I nodded, telling him about the similar murder we had weeks prior, offering to share whatever information we had. He appreciated the help and went back inside. With nothing more we could do there, I offered to drive Ryan home. During the ride, I told him how much I appreciated him, how much his words meant to me, but I also made it clear that I still needed to figure this case out. He understood, but he made me promise to be careful. He told me that his future kids needed their uncle. I smiled and promised that I'd come back. The next day after work, I returned to the crime scene. I spent hours talking to anyone who might have seen or heard anything, desperately searching for a lead. But as the sun began to set, I found myself running out of options. I was about to call it a night when I realized there was one house I hadn't checked yet. I walked up and knocked on the door. After a few moments, an elderly woman answered. She introduced herself as Ms. Watson. I introduced myself as a detective, but she looked at me with a puzzled expression. She told me she had already spoken to the police. But then she frowned slightly, adding that they didn't seem too interested in what she had to say. I told her there had been some new developments in the case, though that was a lie. I needed her to repeat what she had told the police the day before to make sure nothing had been overlooked. She took a moment to think, then pointed toward the woods. It wasn't about what she had seen, it was what she knew. She was certain what had happened was connected to whatever lurked out there. When I pressed her for more, she explained that her grandnephew, Boris, had shot something in the leg a few weeks ago when it had tried to attack him. He hadn't been able to identify what it was, only that it looked strange. The fact that something had come hobbling out of the woods, got shot, and yet the police had shown no interest, that didn't sit right with me. There should have been officers patrolling this area every night. I asked if Boris had ever seen it before, if he had any idea where it came from. She shook her head, saying she had only heard stories about strange things in those woods. According to Boris, the thing he shot had let out a groan that almost sounded human. She admitted she had heard a similar sound the previous night, right around the time the woman and her child had been killed. Tragic, really. I thanked her for the information, letting her know we would keep in touch if anything new came up. As I walked back to my car, I started piecing everything together. What did I actually have? 4 attacks, 3 dead, 1 survivor who had been severely injured, 1 who had managed to scare whatever it was away. In both cases where someone survived, the common factor was that they had used a gun. These things reacted to being shot, which meant I had a weapon that could at least slow them down. Another connection was the location. All of the cases had happened near or within a few miles of the woods. That wasn't a coincidence. I knew from my conversation with Leonard Houston which trail to focus on, though it was still possible that the encounter on the trail had just been a random crossing of paths. Checking a map on my phone, I saw that the trailhead was directly north of where Ernie Garrison had been murdered. A straight walk south would take you to the apartment complex. Keep going, and you'd reach the home of the mother and child. Even if the trailhead wasn't exactly where these things were coming from, it had to be close. I finally had a direction to move in. I considered bringing Officer Ryan or Detective Joss along. Maybe I could fake a tip about the killer hiding in the woods and get backup. We could comb the forest together, unload a storm of bullets at anything that moved. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't do it. I wouldn't put them in that kind of danger. Wouldn't lead them into a situation where they could be ambushed in the dark by something we didn't understand. If I called for backup, how many officers would have to learn the truth? The chief wouldn't be happy about that, and worse, I kept thinking about what Leonard Houston and Maria Alvarez had told me. Sure, they had survived their encounters, but knowing what was out there had wrecked them. The knowledge alone had destroyed Leonard's life. How could I willingly inflict that on anyone else? I know some would call my decision reckless or irresponsible, but in my mind, I was doing the right thing, so I did the only thing I could. I went alone. Every day after work, I drove the perimeter of the woods. I walked the trail Leonard had been on the night he was attacked. I took notes, mapped out the terrain, tried to find anything that could give me a clue as to where these things came from. Nothing else in my life mattered anymore. I was determined to see this through. Then, one night, everything changed. The air was damp, the trail muddy beneath my boots. I had been walking for hours when I finally decided to take a break, sitting down on a fallen log. That was when I heard it. A groan. A whine. The sound was distant but distinct, coming from somewhere in front of me. I grabbed my flashlight, aiming it in that direction, but the trees were too thick to see much of anything. Then the sound shifted. This time, it came from my left. A rustling noise followed. My pulse spiked. I cursed under my breath and pulled my pistol, aiming toward the noise. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to relax. Maybe it was just a small animal, a raccoon, a deer, normal forest sounds. But just as I was convincing myself to sit back down, another groan cut through the night. Low, guttural, unmistakably human, and then came the footsteps. Fast, heavy, coming straight for me. Adrenaline flooded my body. I didn't think, I moved. I darted forward, zigzagging between trees, trying to put something, anything, between me and whatever was hunting me. I could hear it crashing through the undergrowth, the weight of its footfalls shaking the earth beneath me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. My lungs burned as I forced myself to stay still. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. It was waiting for me, listening. If it operated at night, then it likely had heightened senses, which meant that if I so much as took the wrong breath, it would hear me. I had one shot, one chance to make a move, but it was pitch black. If I was going to act, I needed to use my flashlight to see where to aim. But turning it on meant giving away my position, and if I missed, if I didn't land a perfect shot, then I wasn't making it out of these woods alive. I turned off the safety, cocked my gun, and took a deep breath, counting under my breath as I prepared myself. 1, 2, 3. Swinging my flashlight toward the last place I had heard the noise, I illuminated the creature, and the sight of it made my stomach churn. I couldn't tell if it was human or something caught in between. Its body was twisted and malformed. A crooked humanoid figure missing both arms, yet instead of feet it had two hairy, hand-like appendages that splayed awkwardly against the ground. Its chest was asymmetrical, one side sagging with a single deflated breast while the other was flat, the rib cage visible beneath its pale, sickly skin. But its head was the worst part. The thing had a lumpy, oversized head, at least 2 feet tall, covered in uneven tufts of greasy hair. Its mouth hung slack, revealing swollen gums and a row of yellow, uneven teeth. No eyes, just an empty face with that gaping maw. Despite being blind, the creature still turned toward me, groaning as it started shambling forward. I didn't let it get close. As soon as it moved, I unloaded my pistol into it. The first shot to the head stunned it. A second made it falter, wobbling on its already weak legs, but I didn't stop. Again and again, I pulled the trigger, pumping lead into its grotesque body until it collapsed in the dirt, unmoving. Silence followed. I let out a heavy breath, my heart hammering in my chest as I stared at the thing lying dead before me. Had I done it? Was this finally over? Something didn't feel right. I stepped forward cautiously, shining my flashlight over its legs, searching for something, anything that would confirm it was the same creature Boris had shot weeks ago. But there were no gunshot wounds, no signs of healing. Frowning, I flipped the body over, scanning its torso, and there it was, a patch of scar tissue on its gut, a sign of an old wound. This was Leonard Houston's monster, not Boris's, which meant there was at least one more out there. My grip tightened on my flashlight as I turned it toward where the thing had first appeared. Walking forward, I found a faint, messy path through the brush, its large, hand-like feet leaving deep imprints in the wet ground. It had come from somewhere, and I was going to find out where. I followed the trail through the underbrush until I reached the mouth of a massive storm drain, wide enough to walk through, its interior dark and partially flooded. Standing at the entrance, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I don't believe in hell, but in that moment, staring into the gaping tunnel, I swore it was a passage straight into something worse. Everything inside me screamed to turn back, to walk away and never come near this place again. But I knew this was where I needed to be. I searched the ground for a thick, sturdy branch, something I could use as a makeshift weapon, and gripped it tight as I returned to the tunnel. Taking a deep breath, I reloaded my gun, readied my flashlight, and stepped inside. The deeper I went, the more the tension built in my chest. Every drip of water echoed, every sound sent a spike of adrenaline through me. Shadows twisted along the tunnel walls, vague and shapeless, making my pulse race. Then I saw it. What I thought was a human body floating face down in the water. My heart leapt into my throat as I rushed forward, but when I turned it over, bile rose in my throat. It wasn't human. It was the rotting corpse of the hermit. His face had been partially eaten, chunks of flesh missing, the inside of his skull hollowed out. I gagged, stepping back in horror. Monsters weren't kind to each other, it seemed. Dropping the body, I spat on it and kept moving. As I walked, my mind wandered, replaying everything that had led me here, the choices I had made, the things I had seen. Ryan's words echoed in my head. How far are you willing to go? What are your limits? I had been so focused on finding answers, on putting an end to this nightmare, that I had never stopped to ask why. Why had I let this consume me? What had I been chasing all this time? Then, a sound broke through my thoughts, a familiar groan. I froze, muscles tensing as I took slow, careful steps forward. My flashlight illuminated another creature, but this one was different. It was larger, its frame thicker, its chest broader and more defined, patches of coarse hair sprouting from its grotesque head. Unlike the first one, it had black, beady eyes, the only sign of awareness on its otherwise warped face. Its leg was riddled with bullet wounds, and a golden pocket knife was lodged deep into its side. This was it. This was the one that had started everything, the one that had killed Ernie Garrison. The one that had butchered an innocent mother and her child. It let out a sharp, guttural scream, stomping the water with its hairy feet in a display of aggression. But I didn't move. I held my ground. It screamed again, puffing out its chest, its hairs standing on end, trying to intimidate me. But I wasn't backing down. It must have realized that, because instead of charging, it suddenly turned, spat onto the ground, and started limping away. Like hell, I was letting it get away. I sprinted forward, leaping into the air and bringing my makeshift club down on the back of its head. The stick shattered against its thick skull, but the force was enough to knock it over. It wriggled on the ground, thrashing as I reached for my pistol. I fired a shot into its spine. It screamed, another into its injured leg, another into its back. I thought of Ernie Garrison, of Boris, of that mother and her child. Rage boiled in my veins, blinding me. I stepped over it and emptied my entire magazine into its skull, pulling the trigger until there was nothing left but clicks. But I wasn't done. I flipped the body over and brought the butt of my gun down onto its face, again and again, smashing its grotesque features into unrecognizable pulp. I only stopped when my arms could no longer lift the weapon. Silence. My breath was ragged, my body trembling as I stared down at the mess I had made. It was over. It had to be over. But as I turned to leave, a sound echoed deeper in the tunnel. My stomach dropped. Please, don't tell me there's another one. Gripping the broken remains of my stick, I lifted my flashlight and moved toward the noise. Careful steps. Slow breaths. Then I saw them. 5 smaller versions of the creatures, huddled together in a nest of rotting flesh. They weren't just wandering monsters. They were breeding. I refused to let the younglings even have the chance to grow into the same monsters their parents had become. With the remains of my weapon, I did what had to be done, ensuring the bloodline ended right then and there. When it was over, I dragged myself back to my car, every step heavier than the last. I couldn't tell you what was on my mind because there was nothing there, just blank emptiness. No feeling of victory, no sense of triumph, just an overwhelming need to get out of those damned woods. When I finally reached my car, I sank into the seat and let the warmth of the heater wash over me. I must have sat there for half an hour, basking in the simple comfort of the familiar, letting myself exist in that moment of safety. Eventually, I pulled out my phone and called the chief, telling him everything. I gave him the location of the bodies and left it up to him to do whatever needed to be done. But I made it clear, I wouldn't be there to see it through. I drove straight home, took the hottest shower of my life, and let the water rinse away the filth, the blood, the memories. 20 minutes later, dressed in clean clothes, I made my way to the only place I knew I needed to be. The local bar. The bartender barely said a word when I sat down, but her eyes held a quiet understanding. She had probably seen more broken men walk through those doors than she could count. When she poured me an extra shot of whiskey on the house, I knew she could tell I was one of them. That night, I wanted nothing more than to forget. 2 shots in and I was already well on my way. Just as I was settling into that warm haze of drunkenness, a familiar voice cut through the fog, calling my name. I turned and found myself staring at Detective Joss. Her face flushed, her expression bright with a wide, slightly tipsy smile. She was already a few drinks in. She wasted no time, sliding onto the stool next to mine, saying she hoped I didn't mind her using me as an excuse to escape a group of persistent drunk men. I laughed, telling her I had no problem with it, though I had never pegged her as the bar-going type. She admitted she liked to dress up and come here on Fridays, but she had never seen me before and asked what brought me in. Then, with a smirk, she eyed my drink choice and commented that the fact I was a cider guy explained a lot. I rolled my eyes and told her I didn't usually go out drinking alone, but it had been a rough night. And then I asked her why the hell she was calling me by my last name in a bar. It felt too formal. She shrugged and admitted she said it so often at work that she had honestly forgotten my first name. I chuckled, finally giving it to her. Debere Femi Smith. I explained that my mom was Nigerian, my dad was from Birmingham, and they had wanted to keep a connection to their roots while still carrying my dad's last name. Most people just called me Dre growing up. She leaned in, intrigued, telling me she found that fascinating, saying there was real history behind my name. I shrugged, admitting that this was different from our usual interaction. Normally, we threw playful jabs at each other. Now she was here, genuinely interested in my life. It was unexpected. She pulled back, agreeing that it was different, then admitted something that caught my attention. She told me she knew she could be overbearing at work, always on my case, but she wasn't like that in real life. It was just work was one of the few places where she could keep her mind off things, and she got intense. That piqued my curiosity, so I asked her what she meant. At first she hesitated, but with a little prodding she finally opened up, and what she told me was a lot to take in. She had grown up with a father who was a cop, but not a good one. Not in terms of skill, but as a person. He was corrupt, power-hungry, the kind of man who tainted the very concept of justice. And at home, he was no better. Cold, distant, verbally abusive. She had spent her whole life wanting to be better than him, to prove that the badge could stand for something good. She worked harder than anyone else, climbing the ranks, making sure things were done the right way. But then, when it came to her personal life, it all fell apart. She had been married once to a man she thought was perfect, until she found him in bed with someone else. The fallout was brutal. Blame was thrown, fights became a nightly occurrence. He accused her of being too obsessed with work. She accused him of never wanting a real family to give her a reason to slow down. In the end, divorce papers were signed and she was left alone. Depression hit her hard, and the only thing she had left was the job, the one thing that could keep her mind occupied. I listened in silence, offering condolences, but she waved them off. She told me she wasn't looking for pity. She was a fighter, always had been, and she was determined to build the life she wanted despite everything. But then, she hit me with a question that made my stomach drop. What about me? She had heard I left homicide before she arrived, and now I was back. What happened? I could have lied, given her some vague excuse about needing a change or wanting a challenge, but she had just bared her soul to me. Told me things I was sure she hadn't told many people, and I remembered what Maria Alvarez had said. Truth is owed truth. So I told her everything. I told her about the night my wife and son were murdered in our home while I was away. How I had come back from working a case to find them both dead in the master bedroom. How the police had shown up, made their empty reassurances that they'd find who did it. But I hadn't waited. I had driven around the entire county, chasing leads, following up on every possible clue. I had checked, double-checked, and triple-checked every piece of information, hoping to find the person responsible, hoping to put a bullet between their eyes. In the end, I never found them. The case remains cold to this day. The only thing we ever had to go on was some grainy surveillance footage of a man walking away from the scene. He was only on camera for a few seconds, but I must have spent countless hours watching it on repeat, hoping that each time I'd see something new, something relevant, something that would give me even the faintest clue as to who he was, but I never did. No matter how many times I studied the frame, slowed it down, enhanced it, nothing changed. The shadowy figure remained just that, an unidentifiable ghost slipping away into the night. Eventually I left homicide. Seeing dead bodies every day became unbearable. Every crime scene dragging me back to that night, making me relive the horror, making me break down when I thought of my family. I couldn't do it anymore. Joss was silent for a long time after I told her. I could see the shock on her face, the way she was trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed sufficient. Finally, she let out a breath, saying she had no idea and that she was so sorry. I told her it was okay, that I had gone through a lot of personal growth trying to move on. It never really leaves you, and honestly it shouldn't, but I was making progress and that was all that mattered. For the next few hours we drank and bonded over our respective traumas, swapping stories, comparing experiences, and somehow, in the middle of all that, transitioning into normal conversation. We talked about movies, music, politics, space. anything and everything. At one point, she even told me about a psychedelic trip she had while visiting family in Sweden, and I couldn't help but laugh at how ridiculous some of her stories were. Ryan had mentioned before that she was cool, but this was the first time I really saw it for myself. Eventually, though, as all good things do, our conversation had to come to a close. The alcohol had finally settled in, and exhaustion was hitting me like a brick wall. Just as I was getting ready to leave, she casually mentioned that her family owned a cabin a few hours away. She had originally planned on going there with some friends, but those plans had fallen through, and then, almost hesitantly, she asked if I wanted to go instead. I thought about it for a second before telling her I'd love to. With that, I stepped out into the frigid night air and started heading home, my breath visible in the cold, my mind for once not weighed down by the past. The drive back gave me nothing but time to reflect on everything. The choices I had made, the people I had met, the darkness I had faced, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to let my mind wander without being haunted by the ghosts of my failures. A small smile crept onto my face, and for now, that was enough. As always, stay safe, everyone.